The night he disappeared, I realized someone had been watching me long before I noticed him. The rain tapped softly against the restaurant windows, blurring the city lights into streaks of gold and gray, and I stood there with a tray in my hands, pretending I wasn't counting every second until my shift ended, pretending my wrist didn't ache under the sleeve I kept pulling down, pretending I was just another waitress in a place where people like me didn't belong. But my hands gave me away, they always did, trembling just enough to make the glasses clink together as I walked past table 12 where the air felt heavier, quieter, wrong, and I heard it, just fragments at first. Shipment, Thursday, dock numbers I didn't understand but knew I shouldn't hear. My breath caught, my fingers tightened, and one glass slipped, just enough to tilt the tray and send a sharp ringing sound through the room that didn't belong in a place this polished, this controlled, and everything stopped. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a subtle shift like the world holding its breath, and that's when I felt it. Not a sound, not a touch, just a presence, the kind that makes your skin tighten before your mind catches up, and when I looked up, he was already looking at me, like he had been for a while, like he'd been waiting for me to make a mistake. Dominic Russo didn't need an introduction, not here, not anywhere. People moved around him without realizing they were doing it. Conversations lowered without being asked, and I stood there frozen, my tray suddenly too heavy, my heartbeat too loud. And his eyes didn't go to my face first, they dropped to my wrist, to the edge of fabric I hadn't fixed in time, to the faint discoloration I'd spent 20 minutes covering in the mirror of a bathroom that smelled like cheap soap and exhaustion. And something in his expression shifted, not shock, not anger, something colder, something precise, like he had just solved a problem he hadn't known he was looking for. And then he moved, not fast, not slow, just inevitable, closing the distance between us like the rest of the room didn't exist. And when his hand steadied the edge of my tray, it was firm, controlled, nothing like the hands I was used to, and his voice was low, almost lost under the soft music. But I heard every word like it was meant only for me. "You should be more careful," he said, but his eyes didn't leave my wrist, and I swallowed, forcing a smile that felt too thin. "I'm fine," I whispered, the lie automatic, practiced, safe. But something told me he didn't believe me, and worse, he didn't need to, because he already knew. And when he finally looked up at me, really looked, it felt like standing under a light too bright to hide anything. And then he said it. Quiet, certain, like a promise I didn't understand yet. "He won't touch you again," and I didn't know why that scared me more than anything I had heard all night. I should have walked away after he said it, but my feet did not move, they never did, when something felt bigger than me and the rest of my shift passed like a blur of plates and forced smiles, except I could feel him there, not watching in the way men usually did, not staring, not lingering, just aware, like he had placed me somewhere in his mind. And I could not step out of it, even when I stayed in the kitchen longer than necessary, even when I avoided table 12 completely, even when I told myself it meant nothing, that he meant nothing, that men like him did not notice girls like me unless there was a reason, and I did not want to know what that reason was. The clock finally hit midnight, and the relief should have been immediate, but it was not. It sat heavy in my chest as I stepped outside into the damp night air. The rain had stopped, but everything still smelled like it, asphalt and metal, and something cold that settled into my bones. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and started walking toward the bus stop 3 blocks down, keeping my head low like I always did, counting my steps like it would somehow get me home faster. And for a moment, I let myself believe it was just another night, that nothing had changed, that his words had been nothing more than a strange passing comment from a man who lived in a different world than I did. And then I saw the car. It was parked across the street. Engine off, lights dark, but I knew it had not been there before, because I always checked. I always noticed things like that. Now my grip tightened on my bag, and I told myself not to panic, not to assume, but my pulse was already climbing, each beat louder than the last, and I kept walking slower, now more careful, my eyes flicking up, just enough to see shapes, movement, anything that did not belong. And then the driver door opened, not sudden, not aggressive, just deliberate, and a man stepped out. Not him, not Dominic, but someone who carried the same quiet control, the same stillness that made everything around him feel less important. He did not come closer. He did not block my path. He just stood there, hands visible, posture relaxed, like he had all the time in the world. "Miss Brooks," he said, and hearing my name from a stranger at 1 in the morning made something cold slide down my spine. I did not answer, I did not stop, but my steps slowed anyway, because some part of me already knew this was not random. This was not coincidence, this was connected to him, to that moment, to the way he had looked at me like he had already made a decision. I had not agreed to. You do not need to be afraid, the man continued, his voice calm, almost polite, but it did not help, because fear does not listen to calm words, it listens to patterns. And this felt like the beginning of one. Mr. Russo asked me to make sure you get home safely tonight, and that was it. Not a threat, not a demand, just a statement, but it landed heavier than anything else, because it meant he had not forgotten. It meant he had meant what he said. And as I stood there between the dim streetlight and the waiting car, I realized something I had not felt in a long time, something unfamiliar and dangerous. I was not alone anymore, and I did not know if that was supposed to make me feel safer or not. I did not remember getting into the car. I only remembered the way my feet hesitated for half a second before moving, like something inside me had already decided that refusing was not really an option, and the door closed with a quiet click that sounded too final for something so simple. The inside smelled clean leather and something subtle, expensive, not overwhelming, just enough to remind me this was not my world. The man did not speak again as he drove, and I sat there with my hands folded too tightly in my lap, staring out at the passing streetlights, as if I could memorize every turn, every corner, in case I needed to explain this later. But explain what? That a stranger knew my name, that another man I had met only once had decided I needed an escort home, that nothing about this felt normal, and yet nothing about it felt chaotic either. It was controlled, every second measured, like I had stepped into a story that had already been written without asking me first. When we reached my building, the car slowed smoothly and stopped exactly in front of the entrance, like it had done this before, like it knew where I lived, because of course it did. That thought settled heavily in my chest as I reached for the handle. Thank you, I said, because I did not know what else to say, and the man only gave a small nod, not looking at me. As I stepped out into the quiet street, the air colder, now sharper against my skin, and for a moment I just stood there watching the car pull away until its taillights disappeared around the corner, leaving me alone again, or at least it should have felt like being alone, but it did not. Not really. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, each step echoing louder than usual, the hallway light flickering once before settling into a dim, steady glow, and I told myself everything was fine, that I was overthinking, that people with money and power did strange things that did not have to mean anything for me. But my hand paused on the doorknob, because something felt different, not wrong exactly, just off, like walking into a room where the air has shifted in a way you cannot explain. I pushed the door open slowly, and the first thing I noticed was the silence. No television, no movement, no voice calling my name. Just stillness stretching across the small space, and my chest tightened, because even on his quiet nights, he was never this quiet. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me, and the apartment looked the same, nothing broken, nothing disturbed, just empty. His shoes were gone from beside the couch. The jacket he always left hanging was missing. The half-empty coffee mug on the counter had been rinsed clean, like someone had taken the time to erase traces instead of leaving them behind. And that was when it hit me, not fear, not relief, something in between, something unsteady, because this was not how people left. Not without a word, not without a message, not without something that made sense. I moved further and slowly, like I was afraid the room might shift again if I went too fast. My phone buzzed in my pocket, making me flinch, and for a second I did not want to look, because some part of me already knew, I already understood, that whatever was happening had not ended outside on that street. It had followed me here. I pulled the phone out, my fingers colder than they should have been, and the screen lit up with a message from an unknown number, just one line. No explanation, no name, no room for misunderstanding. You are safe now. And I stood there in the middle of my apartment, staring at those words as they settled into something real, something permanent. And for the first time since this started, I did not know if I should feel grateful or afraid. The message stayed on my screen longer than it should have, like if I stared at it long enough, it would change into something harmless, something explainable. But it did not. It stayed the same, 3 words, simple, clean, impossible to misunderstand. You are safe now. I read it again and again, like there was something hidden between the letters, some clue about what had actually happened in the hours I could not account for. But there was nothing, just certainty, the kind that does not ask permission to settle into your life. I did not sleep that night. I sat on the edge of my bed with the lights on, listening to every sound in the building, footsteps in the hallway, pipes shifting somewhere in the walls, a car Passing outside, each noise too sharp, too loud, like my senses had been turned up without warning, and every time my phone lit up from a random notification, my heart jumped like it expected another message from that same number. But nothing else came, just silence stretching into morning when the pale light slipped through the blinds and made everything look too normal, too unchanged for a night that felt like it had rewritten something inside me. I moved through my routine slowly, getting dressed, choosing a long-sleeve shirt, without thinking, even though there was nothing to hide anymore, at least not in the way there had been before, and that realization stopped me halfway to the door, because for the first time in months, I did not feel that familiar tension in my chest, that constant awareness of someone else in my space, someone unpredictable, someone I had learned to adjust around without realizing it. And now that absence felt just as heavy as his presence. Once had I left the apartment, stepping into the cool morning air, and the city moved the same way it always did, people rushing coffee in hand, cars lining up at red lights, conversations blending into background noise, and I searched for something different, some sign that the world had shifted along with my life. But there was nothing. Everything looked exactly as it had the day before, except I was not the same person walking through it. When I reached the restaurant, the routine pulled me in automatically, tying my apron, checking tables, greeting customers like none of this had happened, like I had not received a message that changed everything in the quietest way possible. But it was there under the surface, in every movement, in the way my hands did not shake as much, in the way I caught myself glancing toward the entrance without meaning to, as if expecting something or someone. And I told myself he would not come back. That men like Dominic Russo did not circle back for small moments, for brief interactions with people like me. But the thought did not settle. It stayed restless in the back of my mind until the evening slowed and the lights dimmed and the door opened and the room shifted. Again, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for me to feel it before I saw him. And when I did, my breath caught the same way it had the night before, except this time I was not frozen. I was aware of the space between us. Aware of the fact that everything that had happened led back to this moment to him. And he did not look surprised to see me, not even a little, like this was exactly where I was supposed to be. And as he walked toward me, that same controlled presence wrapped around the room, I realized something that settled deeper than fear, deeper than confusion. This was not over. It had only just begun. He did not stop. When he reached my table, he did not hesitate or look around like he needed permission to exist in that space. He simply stood there, and the air shifted with him, like the room adjusted itself to fit his presence. And for a second I forgot how to breathe, because this was not a coincidence, this was not chance, this was intention, and I could feel it in the way his eyes found mine immediately, not searching, not questioning, just landing like they already knew where I would be. You look different, he said, his voice low enough that no one else could hear, but steady, like he was stating a fact, not asking a question. And I swallowed, because I did not know what to say to that, because he was right. Something was different, not just on the surface, not just the absence of fear in my posture, or the way my hands were not trembling around the tray, but deeper, something I could not name. Yet I am just working, I said quietly, the words automatic, safe, but they sounded smaller than they had before, like they did not carry the same weight when I said them now, and his gaze did not shift away from me, not even for a second. You are not pretending as much, he replied, and that made something in my chest tighten, because it felt too accurate, too precise, like he had been watching long enough to notice the difference between who I was before and who I was now. And that realization should have scared me more than it did, but it did not. It grounded me in a way I was not ready to understand. Yet I should go, I added after a moment, gesturing slightly toward the other tables, because standing here felt dangerous in a different way now, not because I was afraid of him, but because I was not. And that felt like a risk I could not measure yet. But his hand moved just slightly, not grabbing, not stopping, just enough to pause me without touching, and that control, that restraint, made my breath catch more than any force would have. You can, he said calmly, but his eyes held mine a second longer, like there was something else, there's something unspoken that did not need words. And then he stepped past me, taking a seat, like this was just another night, like I was just another part of it. But I knew better now. I knew nothing about this was casual, nothing about him ever would be, and the rest of the evening moved around me like a current I could not quite step out of. I served tables, I smiled, I moved through the motions, but my awareness stayed anchored to him, to where he sat, to the way he barely spoke to the men around him, to the way everything seemed to orbit quietly around his presence. And when I passed his table again, he did not look up. Immediately he waited until I was just about to move And then his voice reached me again, soft, controlled. "You got my message," and my fingers tightened around the edge of the tray, just slightly enough for me to notice, but not enough for anyone else to see, and I nodded, because there was no point denying it, no point pretending anymore. And something in his expression shifted, not satisfaction, not pride, something quieter, something that felt like confirmation. "Good," he said simply, and then after a pause that stretched just long enough to matter, "You understand what it means." And that was when my heartbeat changed, not faster, not panic, just heavier, because I realized this was not about what had already happened, it was about what came next. And for the first time, I was not just reacting to him, I was standing at the edge of a choice I had not asked for, but somehow still had to make. The question stayed with me long after I walked away from his table. It followed me through every step, every order, every forced smile, until the words blurred together, and all I could hear was the quiet weight behind what he had said. "You understand what it means," and the truth was I did not completely, but I understood enough to know this was not something that could be undone, not with distance, not with denial, not even with silence, because whatever line had been crossed, it had not been mine to draw in the first place. By the time my shift ended, the restaurant felt smaller, like the walls had moved in just enough to remind me I did not fit here the same way anymore. I changed quickly, avoiding mirrors, not because I was hiding anything now, but because I did not recognize the version of myself looking back, and that unsettled me more than anything else had that night outside. The air was colder than before, the kind that settles into your lungs and makes each breath feel sharper, more real, and I paused just outside the door, my eyes scanning the street automatically. But this time it was not fear guiding me, it was expectation, and that difference mattered more than I wanted to admit. The car was there again, parked in the same quiet way, like it had always belonged to the street, and the man stepped out just like before, calm, controlled, predictable, in a way that made everything else feel uncertain. "At least you are consistent," I said before I could stop myself, and my voice sounded steadier than I felt, which surprised me more than it should have been. He gave a slight nod, not offended, not amused, just acknowledging the statement. "Mr. Russo prefers patterns," he replied simply, as if that explained everything, and maybe it did. Maybe men like Dominic built their world on predictability, on control, on knowing exactly where everything was supposed to be, including people like me. I hesitated for a second, longer than necessary, before opening the car door. This time, I noticed more the clean lines, the quiet hum of the engine, the way nothing felt out of place, like even the smallest detail had been chosen deliberately. And as we pulled away from the curb, I watched the restaurant disappear in the side mirror, until it was just another building on another street. And for the first time, I wondered if I would ever walk out of it feeling the same again. The ride was silent again, but it did not feel as heavy as before, maybe because I knew what to expect now, or maybe because some part of me had already accepted that this was not temporary, that whatever Dominic had decided had not ended with one night or one message. When we stopped in front of my building, I did not rush to get out. I sat there for a moment, my hand resting on the door handle, because leaving meant returning to a space that no longer held the same weight as before, a space that felt too quiet, too empty. "In a way, I had not chosen you. Can tell him I do not need this," I said finally, the words careful, measured, because I was not sure if they were entirely true, but I needed to say them anyway, needed to test if I still had a say in any of this. The man glanced at me briefly for the first time, his expression unchanged. He already knows that, he answered, and that response settled into me in a way I could not ignore, because it meant this was not about what I needed or did not need. It was about something else, something that did not require my permission. And as I stepped out into the night again, I realized the difference between before and now was not just that I was no longer afraid, it was that I was starting to understand him, and that might be the most dangerous part of all. The apartment felt different again when I stepped inside, not because anything had changed, but because I had, and that realization followed me through every quiet second as I set my keys down on the counter and stood there longer than necessary, like I was waiting for something to interrupt the stillness, but nothing did. No raised voice, no tension in the air, no unpredictable shift in mood, just silence, clean and uninterrupted, and I did not know what to do with it. I moved through the space, slowly touching things without thinking, the back of a chair, the edge of the table, grounding myself in something familiar, even though it all felt slightly distant now, like I was standing just outside my own life. Looking in my phone buzzed again, and my chest tightened before I even reached for it, because part of me already expected who it would be, but it was not an unknown number this time. It was the restaurant manager. asking if I could cover an extra shift tomorrow, normal, ordinary routine, and I stared at the message longer than I should have, because it felt strange how quickly life tried to continue, as if nothing significant had happened, as if I had not crossed into something I did not fully understand, yet I typed back a simple yes, and set the phone down, but my mind did not settle. It stayed active, replaying every moment, every word, every look until one detail surfaced stronger than the rest. You understand what it means? I exhaled, slowly leaning back against the counter, because maybe I did understand more than I wanted to admit. It meant this was not temporary. It meant he had decided something about me, without asking, and more than that, it meant I had not walked away when I had the chance. The next morning came too quickly, the sunlight sharper than usual, as it filled the apartment, and I got ready for work with a strange sense of awareness, like I was stepping into a version of my life that had already shifted slightly off its original path. The walk to the restaurant felt shorter, or maybe I just noticed less along the way, my thoughts too focused, too aware of the pattern that had started forming. When I reached the door, I paused again, my hand resting on the handle, because something in me recognized this moment as a choice, not a big one, not dramatic, but still a choice to step back into that space, knowing it was no longer just a job anymore. I pushed the door open, and the familiar sounds wrapped around me, conversations, dishes, movement, all blending into something routine, but underneath it there was that same subtle shift, that same awareness that made everything feel just slightly more intense. I tied my apron, took a breath, and started my shift like any other day, but it did not take long before I felt it again, that presence, that quiet gravity that pulled attention without demanding it, and I did not need to look to know he was there, because some part of me had already adjusted to it, had already learned the shape of it. When I finally glanced toward the entrance, he was not walking in, he was already inside, already seated, like he had been there long enough to settle into the space, like he had always been part of it. And this time, when our eyes met, I did not look away, not immediately, not out of fear, but because I was starting to understand something that made my pulse steady instead of spike. This was not about coincidence or curiosity anymore, this was intention. And as I stood there holding his gaze for a second longer than I should have, I realized something that changed everything. I was not just part of his pattern anymore, I was becoming aware of it, and that meant sooner or later I would have to decide if I was going to follow it or break it. The moment stretched longer than it should have. Our eyes locked across the room, like everything in between had faded into something distant and unimportant, and I felt it again, that quiet shift inside me, not fear, not hesitation, something steadier, something that made me hold his gaze just a second longer before I finally looked away. First, not because I had to, but because I chose to, and that difference settled deep as I turned back to my work, my movements sharper, more aware, like I was no longer reacting to the space around me, but moving with intention inside it. The night unfolded slowly, conversations blending into a low hum, glasses clinking, soft music filling the gaps. But underneath it all there was that constant awareness of him, not watching, not hovering, just there like a fixed point. Everything else moved around, and I caught myself adjusting to it without thinking, timing my steps differently, choosing paths that brought me near his table without making it obvious, until eventually it did not feel like avoidance or coincidence anymore. It felt like something else, something quieter, something deliberate. When I finally approached his table, it was not because I had been assigned to it, it was because I decided to, and that realization hit me mid-step. But I did not stop. I placed a glass of water down in front of him carefully, my hand steady, and he looked up immediately, like he had expected me to be there all along. You are getting used to this, he said, his voice low enough that it did not reach beyond the table, and I tilted my head slightly, because the words could have meant anything, but the way he said them made it clear he was not talking about the job or the room or even the routine. I am getting used to not being afraid, I replied before I could second-guess it, and the truth of it surprised me more than anything else had tonight, because it was real, it was honest, and it changed something in the space between us. His gaze held mine a second longer, something unreadable passing through it, before he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, like I had confirmed something he already believed. Fear is not useful, he said simply, and there was no arrogance in it, no attempt to control, just a statement like gravity, like something that existed whether I agreed with it or not. And I found myself wondering what kind of life taught someone that, what kind of world made fear unnecessary instead of unavoidable. And before I could stop myself, the question slipped out, then what is? And that was when the air shifted again, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to noticed, but I felt it in the way his attention sharpened just slightly, like I had stepped closer to something I did not fully understand yet control. He answered after a moment, his voice just as calm, just as certain, but heavier now, like the word carried more than its definition, and I exhaled slowly, because I understood that one more than I wanted to admit, not his version, not the kind that shaped rooms and people, but my own, the small, quiet ways I had learned to control my reactions, my voice, my movements, just to keep things steady, just to keep things from breaking. And for a second, we just stood there in that understanding, not the same, but close enough to recognize in each other. And that was when I realized this was not just about him deciding something about me anymore. This was about me deciding something too, because I had walked up to his table without being told I had stayed, without stepping back, and now I was asking questions I was not supposed to ask. And as I straightened up to leave again, I felt it clearly for the first time, not the weight of his presence, not the pull of his world, but the shift in my own. I was no longer just caught in his pattern. I was starting to step into it on my own terms, and I did not know where that would lead. But for the first time, I was not trying to stop it. It should have ended there with a conversation that felt heavier than it looked, with a single word, like control, hanging between us like something unfinished. But it did not end, because nothing about this had ever been that simple. The rest of the night passed in fragments, moments slipping past without fully settling in my memory, except for the awareness of him still there, still present like a constant I had started to measure everything against. And when the last table cleared and the lights dimmed slightly, signaling the end of another shift, I found myself moving slower, not because I was tired, but because something in me was delaying the moment of stepping back into a world that no longer felt separate from his. When I finally stepped outside, the air was quieter than usual, the city settling into that late hour stillness where everything felt suspended, and I paused just beyond the door, not looking for the car this time, not scanning the street, because I already knew it would be there, and it was exactly where it had been the night before, waiting, without urgency, without pressure, just present, like a continuation of something already decided. And I stood there for a second longer than necessary, my thoughts sharper, clearer than they had been before, because now I understood this was not about being followed or protected in the way I had first assumed. It was about consistency, about intention, about a line that had been drawn quietly and firmly, and I had already stepped across it at some point without noticing. When the driver stepped out, he did not speak right away, and I realized something in that silence had changed too. It no longer felt like an instruction or an expectation. It felt like a question, unspoken, but there, and I exhaled slowly before moving toward the car on my own, without waiting, without hesitating. And that was the moment I recognized the shift completely, not in him, not in the situation, but in me. I was no longer being guided into this. I was choosing it piece by piece, step by step, and as I settled into the seat, the familiar quiet wrapped around me again, but it did not feel as heavy this time. It felt controlled, predictable, almost grounding in a way I had not expected. The ride passed quickly, the city lights moving past in steady patterns, and when we reached my building, I did not rush to leave. I sat there for a second, my hand resting lightly against the door, as a thought settled into place, something simple but undeniable. This was not temporary. This was not something that would fade with time or distance, because it had already rooted itself deeper than that. And as I stepped out into the cool night air, I felt it clearly. The absence of fear that had once defined every step I took had been replaced by something else, something quieter but stronger, something that felt like standing on the edge of a decision I had not fully made yet, but was already moving toward. And when I reached my door and stepped inside, the silence greeted me again, but it no longer felt empty. It felt open, like a space waiting to be filled by whatever came next. My phone buzzed once more, and this time I did not hesitate. I already knew who it would be, and when I looked at the screen, the message was simple, just like before, no extra words, no explanation. You are where you need to be. And I stood there in the quiet of my apartment, reading it once, letting it settle into something real, because this time it did not feel like a statement about safety. It felt like something else, something deeper. Something that made my breath slow instead of quicken. And as I lowered the phone, I realized the truth that had been building with every moment since that first night. He had not just removed the part of my life that was breaking me, he had changed the way I saw everything that came after, and I did not know yet if that meant I was stepping into something better or just something different. But I knew one thing for certain: I was not trying to walk away anymore.